Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Spencer Wang, and I'm a Wild Legal Fellow working out of the Business and Human Rights team here at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. I'd like to give a warm welcome and thank you for joining Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights' book club. I'm beyond pleased to be able to introduce this session's book, not only as it speaks to important topics surrounding our present day, but also as the author has been for many years an instrumental part for the RFK Business and Human Rights team. Conscience Incorporated by Michael Posner is a crucial book in an increasingly confusing and changing world. In this era of globalization and corporate expansion, Posner examines the gap in current corporate social responsibility measures and what more needs to be done to address these challenges. To lead that conversation and delve deeper into Posner's latest release, we have our own board member moderating, Lisa Ross, and I have the absolute honor of introducing our moderator for this conversation, Lisa Osborne Ross, former CEO of Edelman. Miss Osborne Ross's resume and accomplishments speak to an impressive career of building impactful solutions and driving change across the public and private sectors. Miss Osborne Ross recently left her position at US CEO of Edelman, where she led employees dedicated to developing communication, campaigns, and actions that evolve, promote, and protect enterprise brands and reputation. She was instrumental in achieving Edelman's milestone status as the world's largest and most profitable public relations firm, with client revenue exceeding $1 billion. Her success pathway was setting a purpose with profitability strategy and vision for the US, serving as a trusted advisor to senior Fortune 500 executives, conducting partnership with higher education and government institutions, and providing counsel on business strategy, social purpose, corporate and public affairs, and DE&I initiatives. She was instrumental in creating and executing Edelman's COVID-19 strategy, its racial justice program, and launching new client offerings like the Societal Issues Navigator and Outfront, which advises clients on LGBTQ issues. Last but not least, she's an essential member of our RFK Human Rights Board, who so kindly serves in our communications committee. In this conversation, centered on how we can reshape the global business ecosystem to be an agent of social betterment, I can't think of a better person to moderate today's program than Ms. Ross. And with that, I thank and welcome Ms. Lisa Osborne Ross. Take it away, Lisa.
Spencer, that was like the most lovely introduction ever. Thank you very, very much. I'm delighted to join this conversation because it is so incredibly important and should introduce Michael. And Michael, before we get started, let me thank you and applaud you for speaking truth and sparking change, which is how I see our role at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. And before we hear what Michael has to say, I would like to talk a little bit about who Michael is. What's interesting to me is not what people say about themselves when they introduce themselves, but what others say about them. So let me start with Hillary Clinton. She says, I was incredibly impressed by Michael's ability to understand the nuances of complicated issues and the interest of varied constituencies while remaining a clear-eyed advocate for justice and liberty. I think that's hard, particularly now. And Michael, I applaud you for that. And I hope by the end of this session, you will equip all of us to be able to have those conversations and to lead in that manner as well. And then on a more personal note, I thought to myself, we must know some of the same people. So of course I asked around, and my dear friend and former colleague, Stephanie Swirsky, said, oh my God, I love Michael. I love Michael. I worked with him on garment initiatives when he was at State. He's fabulous and the nicest guy ever. So you have a lot to live up to, Michael, in this conversation in terms of substance and style. So over to you.
So first of all, thank you, Lisa, for those warm, wonderful words. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm excited to be doing this in part because, as you say, these are quite challenging times. And I think it's really important for all of us to keep our eye on what's important and to find a way forward. There's a lot of paralysis, a lot of hand-wringing. And the book that I wrote, based on 12 years, when I left the State Department, I came to NYU Stern to open the first Human Rights Center at a business school. And part of my thinking was, in a globalized economy, big companies operating around the world have enormous influence. And especially in weak states where there's a governance gap, where governments are not protecting their own people. And so the book is a reflection on and really a distillation of what my colleagues and I have done at NYU over the last 12 years in trying to navigate both what companies should do, again, these big global companies, what Western, in particular, governments should do, and what we need to do as consumers, as investors, as employees, as public citizens. And so I was excited to write the book. It was written a year before the current administration took
Mm,
place, and so it never uses the word Trump. But it is, I think, in some ways more important than when I wrote it, that
yes.
we think about how can companies step up? How can they both make a profit and be responsible? And what's the right relationship between what companies can, should do, but sometimes need to be pushed to do, and what governments can do to play that pushing role to make sure that they're a catalyst to get companies to step up and do the things that they absolutely need to do. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm eager to have a conversation, but this is great.
Great. I looked at the timing of it, and somehow in a very smart way, I think maybe you knew what we were about to experience. And so this feels like a bit of a roadmap for so many who were trying to figure out, how do I make a difference and how do I have an impact? Before we get into our important conversation discussion of key themes and takeaways, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the fifth anniversary of the murder of George Floyd last week. And probably more importantly, corporate America's reaction, corporate America's recognition of harm, corporate America's sense of responsibility, and now the retreat. And so my question is twofold. One, what or is there a difference between human rights and civil rights?
That's a question I ask my students, and
Mm,
part of the answer is that it's the same subject, but the nomenclature in the U.S. We use words like civil rights and civil liberties decades before the UN was created, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So people come out of the civil rights community thinking of the NAACP in 1907 when it was
yes,
founded, or the ACLU in civil liberties in 1920. We didn't have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights till 1948. And in most places in the world, the terms are interchangeable. And so it is one big conversation. It means that we apply rights at home and we apply rights and push for rights protection globally. Um,
yes,
so the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights became the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
right.
Wade Henderson and I worked on that to make the point we're all in this together.
Yes, yeah. I again we'll have a cup of coffee at some point and talk about the beautiful work of Wade and Karen Lawson and Nancy Zirkin and all of those at the leadership conference and their recognition of the intersection of human and civil rights, because I think sometimes in this country it is used to divide us. That if
That's
we're talking about civil rights and that's different from human rights and those people, but overall it's a conversation about justice and injustice. Similarly, what lessons do you think we can learn about the reaction of corporate America and now the retreat
yeah.
that we're seeing with many corporations? I have a point of view on this, but I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I've been I've been really shocked at the pace and speed of the retreat on the issue of diversity being a useful and important concept in the way we live our lives, the way institutions behave, whether it's the private sector or government or universities. It's inescapable to me that giving people a chance to compete and succeed in our world, whether it's in the workplace or in government or in academia, is the right thing to do. It's good for those institutions, it's good for society. And yet, when the president came in and some local state attorneys general around the country decided that diversity was a four-letter word, there's been this massive retreat as though, oh, we're not even allowed to talk about the subject. We can have and should have a debate about DEI programs, what's worked, what hasn't worked. That's a fair discussion. We should have it. But to move in the direction of saying this is no longer part of what we consider important, we're going to take the words off our website. We're going to basically decide that after all that's gone on and all the obvious ways in which diversity is healthy and good for society, we're now retreating, is to me really a shameful act.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that, particularly in the context of what you have written. And as you have said, it is less about giving people an opportunity, but more about improving your outcomes. When you have a diversity of thought and a diversity of opinion and so forth. And so I was always curious about that. And I think from my perspective, you might agree that, those organizations that were about that beforehand still are, and those that jumped on the bandwagon are the ones where you're seeing the retreat. And so, I think we always want to applaud those people who are doing the right thing. You and I seem to agree, you'll tell me, that in a globalized economy, corporations wield real, supersized power, and that as governments continue to stumble in protecting human rights, it's the responsibility, the burden, some might say, the opportunity, others might say, of businesses to lead with conscience. Before I ask my question, are we in agreement on that statement?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, all right. So while we believe this, I just have to ask this really honest question. Do you believe that the average global business is aligned? I mean, I've said it for years, but now wonder if this smacks of some of the elitism and bubble thinking that people are accused of. So what are your thoughts? I mean, it sounds great, but honestly, do we really think that global businesses are paying attention and they believe what we do?
Most global companies are barely paying attention, sadly. They're paying attention mostly in terms of trying to reduce the risk to their reputation. So if
Yes.
there's a crisis, they'll react and they'll try to figure out how to mitigate the damage. But they're not paying attention most. There are some that do, but most companies don't have an affirmative program to say, we actually care about the way we operate, the way we make money. We're not going to do the things we need to do to ensure that we have a better performance on issues like the way we treat workers in a global supply chain. And so we need to keep pushing to make that a business reality. I say to companies, they say, oh, human rights is really a priority. And I say, okay, how are you measuring
Mhm.
performance? You measure returns on investment and productivity and worker retention and efficiency. You have numbers, you have measures. People either get promoted or they lose their job on the basis of performance. If human rights is a business priority, then we need to put it in the same category and get serious about evaluating, using data, using metrics to evaluate, are you actually doing better than you did last year in terms of outcomes, not just process, but outcomes. That's the discussion we need to be having. And I'm afraid there are too few companies right now thinking in that way.
So I'm going to push you in this space a little bit because you talked about measurement and you talked about performance, and I think we both know, my experience as a business leader. At the end of the day, it's the profitability and the bottom line. So let me stay with this. In chapter 11 of the book, you say human rights needs a seat at the boardroom table. I couldn't agree more, but I think today boards and executives, rightfully so, are so focused on unstable economies, unstable governments, tariffs, workforce training and shortages. So how do you convince them that, as you say, good ethics is good business? And Michael, I'm going to ask you, you said there are few companies that are doing that. Who are the companies that are doing it? If you're comfortable naming and identifying who some of those companies are and what they are doing. And then the second part of my question, this is all data driven. is there data, qualitative and quantitative proof of the points that you're making?
Yeah, so there's a couple questions there. First
Hmm.
thing I would say is I live and I talk in the book about living in the ghost of Milton Friedman. 50 years ago, the Chicago Economist basically laid down a principle which has become sacrosanct, especially, I would say, on Wall Street in the American business investment world, that the thing that you have to do is maximize short-term financial returns on investment.
Hmm.
I don't think that's the world in which we live today or should live today. And I was in Europe last week. There's a real difference. There's a divide. Europeans are much more long-term oriented, and they're talking about stakeholder, not just shareholder capitalism. They're looking at how are you treating your employees, the communities where you operate, your consumers, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to get away from Milton Friedman. That was a long time ago. First question. Second point is that there are companies that, in spite of that investor pressure to maximize short-term returns, are making judgments that actually are sensible, in my judgment, to say we can both make a very healthy profit and be responsible. I'll give you a couple of examples. I cite one in the book. Coca-Cola had huge labor problems in Latin America and Colombia. Two union leaders shot on the floor of a bottling plant,
Yeah.
Bogota, and the company, Deval Patrick was involved. He was
Yeah.
general counsel. The company, basically old-fashioned Southern company, said, you know what? We bear responsibility even though we don't own the bottling plant. And
Yes.
brought in a guy named Ed Potter from the International Labor Organization, and he took the company to the next level. He said, we're going to pretend those bottling plants are our possession. They're our
Yes.
property because
Right.
our name is on the bottle.
Right.
Second example would be Microsoft, and I could give a couple of examples. One, I worked with them 7 or 8 years ago as they were thinking about facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology is pretty good at finding people like me, white guys,
Hmm.
not so good for people of color or women.
Hmm.
They were
Me.
selling it to the police. And they made a judgment that technology is not good enough right now to be the basis on which police operate.
Mm.
That was a business. It wasn't at the
Yeah.
center of their business, but they made a business judgment. We can live without that income. They did the same thing actually in China when they bought LinkedIn, social media uh, site, and
Yes.
they realized the government of China was telling them to take down the sites or the accounts of Chinese dissidents, even living in the United States or Hong Kong. They said we're going to change the LinkedIn China and turn it into a resume service. So
Mm.
they said we're not going to take some income, but we're going to do the right thing. I could give you many more examples. There are a number of companies that are making judgments all the time and saying we're going to do the right thing, even if it means we're going to shave a little bit of those profits. We're going to feel better about ourselves. And in the long term, we're going to be better companies.
So that's the theme. That is the red thread, as they say. And you said something that I hope that our audience really hears is that you can make respectable profit. You can feel good. You can pay your bills by just doing the right thing and making some smart decisions. And I think in an environment of and I believe in stakeholder capitalism,
Right.
where stakeholders benefit from it, not so much the shareholders, but stakeholders. But if we could get more people to understand this is good, you
Right.
don't have to make this much money. You don't have to. So there's a level of greed, I think, that comes into it. And what you've identified are these companies that are willing to say, this is good. This is good. But then you have so many more who are saying, but I want this. And in order to do this, I am willing to trample on the rights of other human beings.
Exactly. And I would say, just to add to that, I talk to a lot of senior corporate leaders, CEOs and the like, and what they'll say to me is the thing I most care about, if I think about my company's longevity, is that we recruit and retain the best people.
Yeah.
And the best people are often asking the questions about climate change, about
Yes.
how you're treating your workers. And so there is also there is to me a business case. It's not so much I'm going to improve your returns on investment in the next 3 months, but you're going to be a stronger company if you live by your values and
Yes.
you're able to go out and say to the best people, ours is the place you want to work because of who we are and how we operate.
Yes, I love that. And you also give me an opportunity that I take anytime I can to uplift the importance of having the right people at the table. My mentor and former boss, who recently passed, Alexis Herman, was on the board of Coca-Cola for many years. And at her beautiful service a couple of weeks ago, the CEO of Coca-Cola talked about the role that she played in terms of advising them and saying, just based on her humility as a person, you can be a good, solid company. You can do really, really, really well, but you've got to do the right thing by people. And to your point, you have to have a long-term plan. Everybody wants this quick, fix, but being able to look at things long-term and to make decisions accordingly takes a level of bravery that I just don't think we're seeing in a lot of corporate America right now.
Yeah, no, I so agree. Alexis Herman was also the Secretary of Labor when I was involved in setting up creating the Fair Labor Association.
Yes,
And it was
yes,
her leadership and Gene Sperling and others that made that happen.
yes, yeah. I had the honor of working for her at Labor and at the White House, and it's a impact that I will have for the rest of my life. I started this conversation applauding you for standing and speaking up. And as I said, doing so feels particularly brave and bold right now. And I think there's a real frustration among many of us that people who can and should are not. Um, I remember the big decisions companies had to make in 2022 about whether to stay in Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. And in chapter 10, you highlight this lovely quote that the McDonald's CEO said at the time, our values mean we cannot ignore the human suffering unfolding in Ukraine. Remind us, was that language and that action the exception or the rule? Second question, how do you think the mood and sentiment is different now, and how do you think companies would respond?
So that was a unique or an unusual situation. The Russians, our traditional adversary, had invaded Ukraine baldly and horribly. The world was watching. And the US government made it very clear that it was going to stand up to support the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. That gave companies the green light and the incentive to basically say, let's get out of Ukraine, let's get out of
Get
Russia
out
as
of
fast as
Russia.
we can. And many did, most did, I would say. And I would say, especially for some companies like McDonald's that had a big operation, big set of operations, were successful financially. Again, they made a judgment that it's just not worth it to be there. Some have snuck back in, some evaded all of it, but the wind was at their backs, and there was a lot of publicity about all the companies
Yeah,
leaving. So there was a kind of reinforcement from their competitors. This is the thing to do. We don't generally have that kind of a political consensus. And
right.
so it's much harder for companies when they're in a place that's profitable and no one's really paying a whole lot of attention, to be the one to pull away and to stand out in that sense. So we're in a different place today, much different, again, because we have an administration that is so much turned away from a kind of ethical core, of our foreign policy. And if anything, is rewarding a kind of transactional approach to government and to,
Hmm.
and to the relationship between government and the private sector. So many CEOs and business leaders followed the president to the Gulf states a few weeks ago. That was entirely about trying to figure out how to make some more money. It wasn't about trying to figure out how to bring reform to Saudi Arabia. In
Yeah.
fact, the president said we shouldn't tell other countries how to behave.
Right.
So we're in a very, very different place right now. But I will say, I think whether, let's sort of leave aside the urgency of the moment where we feel democratic system is really being challenged. In the longer term, I would say it's now increasingly obvious, and that's what this book is about, that in a world where so many people, a majority of people live in states where their own governments are either unwilling or unable to protect their own populations.
Yes.
You have these Fortune 500 companies showing up with this enormous economic and really political influence.
Yes.
It's inescapable that the world is going to look at them, if it's Walmart in Bangladesh or Shell in Nigeria or Glencore in the Congo or Meta anyplace,
Right.
going to look at these big companies and say, what are you doing to fill this governance gap? What's your role in all this? And I think it's harder and harder for a big company to say, that's not our business. We follow local law. Let somebody else deal with that. That's not the reality of the world we live in today.
It is probably harder, but to your point earlier, some of them are saying that. That is not my job. That is not, I'm staying in my lane. And the compelling arguments that you make in the book that I wish more could hear is that it is in your long-term interest to engage. Not forget that it's the right thing to do. We know that, but it is in your long-term interest to engage and to not be responsive to the whims of the day, but to have a program and a platform that you believe in, that regardless of the political environment, you execute.
Exactly. And you use the word engage. I'm an engager. I think there's a real value in big global companies going into states where things are not perfect or not even
Yes,
good. I want to see Western companies going there in part one because they're providing jobs. We've lifted 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 50 years. That's the product of globalization. It's the product of people moving from rural to urban, from farms to factories, getting a job. So that's one piece. But the other piece is I want companies that are under some pressure to do the right things on human rights or environment to be in the mix, because that then becomes part of a discussion that goes on domestically. And so I'm always, I'm mindful of the fact that a lot of big companies are operating in places where there's serious problems. I want them to stay, engage, and be part of the solution as opposed to cutting and running.
so let me ask you this question then. We talked about the bravery or the decision that McDonald's made. I was advising a lot of companies during that time, and some decided to stay. And the argument of some was by staying, um, we are supporting the economy, and not everyone in Russia is a part of the regime and so forth. And so it's tricky. It is in some cases, yes, you exit, but in other cases, you leave people and you leave infrastructure. Uh, and when the infrastructure crumbles, nothing is good for anybody around it.
I agree with that. And, we're now almost 3 years into the Russian-Ukraine war. And there are lots of consequences, some unforeseen. But I do think you have to distinguish between companies depending on what they're doing.
Yeah,
So I have a French colleague who represents a drug manufacturer, pharmaceutical company that has some life-saving drugs. I want that company to be able to sell those drugs
right.
to Russian citizens who have cancer. That's a
Right.
very different thing than selling equipment to the Russian military.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think we need to be, one of the things I tell my students after 13 weeks, I say, you're going to be more confused than the moment you walk in here because these things are hard. They're
Yeah.
complicated. There aren't
Yeah.
black and white answers to these things. Issues of sanctions are hard. And I
Yes.
think we have to be mindful that all companies are not created equal, all countries aren't created equal. And we have to take a kind of pragmatic, but a principled view that if you're supporting a regime that is undermining human rights fundamentally, you shouldn't be doing it. If you're
Right.
helping the people of a country and you're helping an economy not fall apart, that's a different conversation.
Right, right. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I loved the first part of your conversation about the alphabets, not that alphabets, but DEI, and now I'm going to throw in ESG,
Hmm.
which is another term. So similarly, the conversation about ESG has changed, and again, I recall everyone rushing to ensure that they had an ESG program set up, and the letters were being bandied about. I'm convinced that many people didn't even know what the letters meant, but people were talking about them. And so, and now people are scrubbing ESG.
Right.
And even when they are holding on to the principles and the approach and the work of ESG, not quickly, they're not scrubbing as quickly as they're dropping DEI. But even when they believe, they are reluctant to use the words. What are your thoughts on how important are the words? Is the work more important, and how you think companies should be handling this?
So I start, I should say, with a somewhat cynical view of how ESG began and what it
Mm,
was and what I think it should be. It was created 20 years ago by the World Economic Forum and a bunch of banks, and the UN was sort of in the middle of it. And the idea was that there are what economists call externalities, issues relating to environment or social, human rights kinds of things. Governance was thrown into the mix. It never really belonged there in the first
mm,
place. But
mhm.
the idea was we're going to now give investors that care about the environment or care about people, we're going to give them a kind of alternative way to evaluate companies. And we're going to create these these mutual funds and other investment vehicles to give them a way to kind of invest in their values. That sounded great, but
Mm,
when they started to put it into practice, we got back to Milton Friedman and the idea that, in effect, ESG funds had to compete against mutual funds, all every other mutual fund or
mhm.
other investment fund. And that meant that you had ESG funds routinely with Exxon and Meta and all these companies that on any rational scorecard would not come out as being environmentally or socially responsible.
Yes, yes.
And so $30 trillion later,
Yeah,
we have this universe of funds that are called ESG funds, and they're virtually indistinguishable
right,
from the others.
right.
And so I think the backlash against ESG, another now four-letter word, is actually an opportunity to rethink this and do it better.
Mm,
When you talk to the big investment firms, the BlackRocks or State Street, they will say, what we're really doing is protecting investors, not people or the planet. Don't take these things to believe we're actually evaluating the performance of anybody other than what are the risks to investors. We need to change that. And one of the things we propose, and I talk about in the book, is first of all, I think you ought to take apart the E and the S. The
mm,
subjects are really important. We
mhm.
ought to be having funds that actually evaluate environmental performance of companies. And you may want to separate that even in several categories. And
Hmm.
certainly on the social side, we could be talking about diversity. We could be talking about labor supply chains. We could be talking about content moderation of social media. We ought to give investors a way to actually evaluate companies in terms of their real record of performance.
Hmm.
We've sort of put forward the notion of creating values funds that do this. And the values fund would go out and say to the investor who cares about the environment or cares about human rights, we're going to give you the list of the best companies. We're going to put those in a fund, and you may make a few cents less every year or a few
Yes,
dollars less.
yes,
We're going
yes.
to be honest with you, we're not now in the same game. This is a different kind of a fund. And I tried that out with one of the super big investment funds. I wrote a kind of critical article the way they were behaving on ESG. And they put me in touch with the person in charge of ESG. And I said, would you be willing to do this real ESG, this values fund?
Mm.
She said to me, no, if we did that, they would know our other ESG funds are bullshit. That was the word
Ah,
he used. The comms guy who was on the line with us said this interview just ended. And I never revealed her name or the name of the company. But that's where we are. We're not in a place where the ESG world that existed before Donald Trump, before the backlash, before
mm.
DeSantis, we didn't have a serious discussion about how you inject environment, human rights, social issues into this in a way that actually is going to make things better. I think we can do it. They say out of adversity comes opportunity. I take this as the moment. Let's reevaluate ESG and come back with something that's stronger.
Yeah, I love the honesty of that conversation about ESG. And I think that's one of the things that we don't do often enough is have an honest evaluation of things that have worked and things that haven't. And you said that from the very beginning, that I think we have to be honest with ourselves and each other in the evaluation of things, even when they are well intended. But if they're not working, you don't have to throw it all out, but let's figure out how we can make them work more effectively. I'm conscious of our time, but I know I have time for two more questions.
Okay.
If I could do anything, I would be a professional student. I would like take a class. I don't want to write the papers. I don't want the grades. I don't want all that, but I would be a student. Because this is about driving change, and we know that young people can be, not always, but can be the biggest drivers of change. My second to last question is, how have your students received your book? What feedback have they given you? And what has surprised you most, maybe in your conversations with them?
Yeah, so it's not a fair sample because the people who take my course are not necessarily the typical business student. 70% of the people who come to Stern or any business school are gunning to work at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. They come in and take finance courses and they barely know that I'm here. But the ones who do come to my class are quite enthusiastic, and I think it's refreshing to them that there is now this broader look at the role of business. I came to Stern, I couldn't believe we were the first human rights center at a business school anywhere in the world. And I thought to myself, this is the 21st century.
Right.
They're 21st century issues, and business schools are still living back in the 1950s or 60s.
Yeah.
The response has been great. I have great classes. There's lots of enthusiasm. And the other thing I will say is with my colleague Dorothy Bauman-Pauley, who is in Geneva and runs a second center now, the Geneva Center on Business and Human Rights, we've begun to set up a network of business schools now in 47 countries where we have at least somebody who's teaching a course or doing research related to this topic. And there's more and more enthusiasm. One of the things I've done with this book is to go out. I think I've been to 16 business schools in the US and Europe, and a lot of them are schools that have never taught human rights. And I
Yes.
find somebody somewhere who says, oh, this is interesting. And then again, the response of students is really enthusiastic. This is part of what we ought to be learning. So part of my mission here is we're teaching the next generation of business leaders. Let's
Yeah.
teach them what business is going to look like in 2030, 2040, 2050 when they're running big companies. This ought to be part of what they know.
And quite frankly, a measurement for me is I would love to see that 70% be 50.
Yeah.
You could at least get, that's some progress, because while you have the small but important group of evangelists and believers, if you could get at least 20% more, that would make all of our life so much easier. My last question. I identified as a goal when we first started, hoping that you would make us better change agents. Because I do think what Secretary Clinton said, respecting different opinions, which is increasingly hard for us to do, recognizing the need of various constituencies, something that we are sometimes unwilling to do, while keeping your eye on the prize, justice and liberty for all. How can we, those who will hear this program, what are the things that we can do to evangelize? What concrete suggestions can you give folks listening to the conversation and others about how they can join in this mission?
So one of the things I wrote a couple of weeks ago for U.S. News, it was a piece about Polish solidarity. In 1980, the ship workers in Gdansk created a union called Solidarity. And within a year, a third of all the Polish adults were part of the union. Most of them had nothing to do with shipbuilding. Almost none of them did. The theory of solidarity in the 1980s was everybody belongs to a chess club. Everybody is in a school. Everybody has a social group that they meet with. Everybody goes to a church. And they have a community of people that they are dealing with on a regular basis. That group needs to be engaged politically and socially to think about what's happening in our society. It's a way actually to engage with people you don't agree with, because you
Right,
might go to church with people or play tennis with people who you don't agree with, but you don't talk about those things.
right, right,
And so the message of that piece was this is our moment to echo solidarity. We all belong somewhere. We have communities that we may be engaging with on some level, but we need to engage, and especially with those with whom we don't agree. We need
right.
to listen. We need to figure out why, or if they're thinking different thoughts, why? What are their grievances? What are their needs? What are their ambitions? Where's their anger coming from? And
Yeah,
we begin to, each of us in our own world, we can't wait for the Messiah. We can't wait for the person who's going to get us out of it. We're going to get ourselves out of this.
yeah,
And we're going to
yeah.
get ourselves out of it by being engaged in the world and with those around us and trying to have a respectful conversation, trying to navigate our differences.
Yeah. One, I love that. One of my favorite priests said to me, and I thought it was so naughty, but I loved it. He said, "You are the Messiah." And I thought, oh my God, nobody hears that. But his point was the difference starts and ends with you, and everyone is waiting for someone to come and tell them what to do or to make a difference where each of us individually has the power and the responsibility to drive change. And I think when people like you use your talent as you have throughout your life, obviously, and then to capture it in a book at this time is critically important. I think we're supposed to take some questions if people have them. I see one that's come up, but God knows I don't know how to ask this question or get it. But I did want to ask you this. If you were to write the book now, we'll go to the questions, but I have one more. If
Yeah.
you were to write the book now, um, what would you include that you didn't before? Anything?
Yeah, I think I would be remiss at this point if I didn't talk about the changes occurring in our own society politically. I felt lucky in a way that I didn't have to deal with that. I wrote the book, to focus on the last 12 years at Stern and with these issues. But the idea that we are now risking democratic values, rule of law, and the like, and what business should do to deal with that. I think
Yeah.
I do have a chapter focusing on the efforts of Ken Chenault, Ken Fraser, and others challenging voting rights infringements in the state of Georgia in 2020. That was a modest version of what we're seeing now. We're seeing essentially a threat broadly to stability, to predictability, to the rule of law, to democratic norms, which I think affects business. And
Yes,
one of the
absolutely.
things I would want to write more about is how do we get business leaders to move beyond their comfort zone, not just to be critical of tariffs or things that are clearly right in their face, but to be really to do what some of the universities have done, what charitable organizations have done, what some of the lawyers have done to basically say, wait, this is a bigger issue than just
Right.
us.
Right, right. Again, that takes a level of bravery. And I think also people have to be committed to believe that there could be a positive outcome by participating in something like that. And I think when people like you write what you have done and teach what you teach, it gives people some indication that they should at least try. I can't tell if we have questions.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions.
Thank God you can see this. Okay.
The first asks about book is a collection of points of inflection business. They're really asking what inspired this format where I advise solutions in each chapter, and how do you think these solutions can be taken further into institutional levels?
Hmm.
I'm very result oriented, so I didn't want to just do a gotcha book. Here's all the terrible things that happen, or here's some anecdotes of a few good things that happen. I really did try in this book, whether I was talking about manufacturing, supply chains, or mining, or the investment sector, or whatever. I wanted to be sure that there was at least some reflection on, okay, where did this leave us? And what are
Hmm.
some of the things that both companies can do and governments can do? So each
Hmm.
chapter has a little bit of that at the end. I'm not sure there are unifying themes that I can say across. In fact, one of the things I would say is that I've come to see as I've dealt with these different sectors, they're all very different.
Yes.
Idea in the environment, you can say, okay, we're going to have a rule about carbon emissions, and that affects a company whether they're an oil producer or they're a manufacturer, they're white collar, or whatever. It's one standard. It's not one standard for business on human rights.
Right.
Meta is I care about very different things when I'm looking at Meta than when I'm looking at Exxon, than I'm looking at Walmart. So I think one of the messages for me is we've got to break this down. We've got to develop standards, metrics, ways of assessing performance for each industry. Each
Yes.
of these
Yes.
industries have, different cultures, but they're doing different things.
Yes.
We're talking about their business model. It's different business model because they're in a different space.
I think that what you just said, though, is missing very much in this conversation. And when I think about my counseling of many companies, they're like people like you, advocates, and others, activists, they don't understand my business. That was something that you would
Right.
hear a lot. And it's like, they don't understand my business. They don't understand I can't do this. They don't understand that, manufacturing can do this, consumer goods cannot do this. But what you just identified was just a very clear and honest recognition that businesses are different. Human rights are the same, but businesses and the execution. And if I asked earlier, like, what are the things that we can do? I think for those who are advising, at least acknowledge, get the business leader to understand, I understand where you're coming from and I understand your business, because you get that credibility, which you don't otherwise without acknowledging it. I now found the second question. Although your book is largely focused on corporate influence in business and human rights, but what do you suggest that consumers do in this day and age when a lot of tech purchases are surrounded by multiple stages of grief, whether the mining in Africa or the manufacturing in China? How can we ethically source tech products that are so necessary to our day-to-day living? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and I don't have a great answer, honestly. We are still a ways away from going back to what we were just talking about. We don't have the data that would tell consumers this company's better than that company. So I can say, and I would say, Coke is better than Pepsi. I've dealt with both companies. I would say Patagonia is better than the Gap. I've dealt with both companies. I could say that Microsoft's better than Meta or Google. I've dealt with those companies. But who am I? And
Mm,
what's that based on? It's anecdotal, it's
mm,
subjective. I'm one guy out
mm.
there in a world that's quite complicated. We need to move to the place when every industry, again, going back to what I just said, every industry has agreed with others, they can't do it alone, that these are the standards that our industry ought to be judged by. We're going to develop metrics. There's going to be some independent way of assessing it. And we're going to have data available for the public to see who's doing better, who's performing better. There's a saying in the business world, Pearson's law says that which is measured improves, that which is measured and made public improves exponentially. At the moment where we really have real data about which apparel company is doing the best by its outsourced workers,
Mm,
or which auto company is doing the best in their getting cobalt from the Congo and
hmm
formalizing the ASM mines,
hmm
then I can answer this question and say to the consumer, you ought to buy a Volkswagen, not a Tesla.
Yeah.
Uh, I would still say that, by the way, but it's not based on the kind of rigor that I think we need for consumers. Really can do a great job here once they have information to make informed purchasing decisions. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, there was a lot of research several years ago that talked about a consumer-driven economy, that consumers decide and they drive changes within companies, whether it's the alphabets, whether it's DEI, ESG, but more and more consumers were saying, I will as I vote, I will also buy based on my values. I don't know that that is the case so much anymore. And I wonder if we're seeing a lessening of that, which is why I very much appreciate this question. Before I turn it over to Spencer to wrap us up, if we are given the opportunity to come back in a year, Michael, and revisit and have this conversation, what are the two or three things that you'd like to say you see a difference in?
Well, one thing I would say, again, going back to our political moment here, we've touched on it, but I think there are maybe a dozen things that I can think of where there's been a critique of the old order. And the critique has some elements of being right. At least it's identified problems that are real. The border is broken, or DEI programs are mixed, or ESG, whatever it is. I think in a year, we ought to be in a place where we've come back with an intelligent response to that and said, here is the right way to do it. Here are some things we've learned, some lessons learned. I don't think we should just be anti-Trump. I think we ought to be pro-diversity and pro-environment and pro-human rights and pro an immigration system that actually works. And
Right.
so I think we need in a year, I'd be happy if we were able to come back, including on these issues relating to business, not
Mhm.
just to say they're not doing enough, but with more blueprints. We need a, blueprint 2025 that Heritage did. We need to be doing that ourselves and say, this is the world we envision and how we suggest getting there, and going out and persuading people this is actually a better vision.
Amen. Spencer?
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much, Michael. I just want to thank you both for an absolutely wonderful conversation. Speaking for myself, I can hear you guys talk for another hour, 2 hours, maybe the rest of the day. But as we close up, I just wanted to highlight, drawing on some of the themes of the business meeting, the challenges of the day that we spoke about today. I wanted to highlight RFK Human Rights, its business and human rights team, which seeks to engage the business and investor community on important human rights considerations. Our work covers four key pillars: just transition, workers' rights, decarceration, responsible technology, and equitable and diversified access to capital. I realize that's five, so five. We seek to build data-driven, inclusive initiatives that drive conversation and engagement with our network of investors and stakeholders. With over 7 trillion assets under management represented in our Compass Investors Network, we hope to drive the large capital movers in our economy to be agents of positive change and responsible business. If you're interested in learning more about the Business and Human Rights team or would like to get involved, please go to our website. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to keep an eye out for our next book club session on our social media and our website. I just want to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Mike and Lisa, for your time. This was absolutely wonderful. And I hope that we all have a wonderful end of our day and end of our week.
Great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both.
Thank
Michael,
you.
I'll grab you for a cup of coffee at some point.
It's a deal.
All right, take care. Thank you, Spencer.